In Montrose County, Colorado, in the spring of 1893, neighbors stopped their wagons and stared in bewilderment as Helena Nowak descended into the earth with a pickaxe and a vision that most people thought had driven her mad. What Helena was building would come to be the most important innovation in her settlement for the next decade. But first, everyone had to think she was crazy. Her grandmother had whispered the secrets of underground food keeping during endless winters in a small village outside Warsaw, teaching a child to see what the earth could provide when snow covered everything above. Helena carried that knowledge across an entire ocean, through a year of agricultural disaster and into the darkest moment of her American dream, when hunger became the greatest threat her adopted community had ever known. And if you want to find out how Helena's madness became her community's salvation, how the neighbors who mocked her came begging for her knowledge, and how her ancient family wisdom revolutionized survival in the harsh Colorado mountains, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Helena Nowak was born in 1859 in the village of Starvation, located about 40 kilometers southeast of Warsaw in the Kingdom of Poland, which at that time was under Russian control. Her family, the Nowaks, were smallhold farmers who cultivated potatoes, rye, and root vegetables on land they did not own, paying rent to Polish landowners who themselves answered to Russian administrators. Life in Starvation was defined by seasonal extremes. Winters lasted from October through March, with temperatures regularly dropping to minus 10 degrees Celsius, and snow accumulation that could reach 4 feet. The village had no modern infrastructure, no railway, no gas lighting, no mechanical refrigeration. Food preservation was not a luxury, but a matter of survival. Those who did not successfully preserve food through the winter simply starved. Helena's grandmother, Anna Kostchewa, was renowned in the village for her knowledge of food preservation techniques inherited from generations of women, stretching back through the 17th century. Anna had learned her craft from her own mother, who learned it from her mother, in an unbroken chain of practical knowledge that predated written records. Helena spent her childhood watching her grandmother work. Anna maintained multiple root cellars, some dug into hillsides, others beneath farmhouse floors. She understood temperature, humidity, and fermentation at a level that modern food scientists would recognize as sophisticated. Anna knew that at 6 feet below the surface, the Earth maintains a relatively constant temperature regardless of the season. In Warsaw's latitude, that underground temperature remained around 8 degrees Celsius year-round, cool enough to prevent bacterial growth and decomposition, but not so cold as to damage the cellular structure of vegetables. Anna fermented cabbage in ceramic pots lined with cloth, creating an environment where beneficial lactobacillus bacteria transformed raw vegetables into stable food that could last a year or more. She stored potatoes in boxes filled with sand, understanding that isolation from light and air prevented sprouting and rotting. She buried root vegetables in pits with specific ratios of vegetables to sand, creating microenvironments where temperature and humidity remained naturally balanced. To Helena, as a young girl, watching her grandmother work in their underground chamber by candlelight, these were not scientific principles, they were magic. They were survival itself. But in the 1880s, life in Russian-occupied Poland was becoming impossible. The Russian government, seeking to eliminate Polish national identity, implemented policies that progressively impoverished Polish farmers. Land taxes increased. Religious persecution accelerated. Young Polish men faced conscription into the Russian army. Rumors circulated through Starvation about America, a place where land was free under the Homestead Act, where religious freedom existed, where a family could own their own property. In 1882, when Helena was 23 years old, she married Helena Nowak, a skilled carpenter and stonemason, 3 years her senior. Joseph had already decided that their future lay in America. In 1883, they sold their few possessions, left their village, and began a journey that would take them across an ocean that many people traveling it never survived. The transatlantic crossing in 1883 took 34 days on a ship called the Pomerania, departing from Hamburg. The ship was crowded with 1,200 passengers, most of them Polish, Jewish, and Italian immigrants seeking American land and opportunity. Conditions were horrific. Disease swept through the crowded holds. Dysentery killed 13 people during the crossing. Helena witnessed a child die from cholera, watched the small body wrapped in cloth, and released into the ocean. She also saw the incredible human resilience of her people, the way families crowded together to share warmth, how women like her organized group prayers and sang to sustain hope. When the Pomerania arrived in Boston on a cold November morning, Helena descended the gangway into a new world, speaking no English, with approximately $15 in her pocket and a head full of her grandmother's knowledge. The family spent their first American winter in a tenement in Boston, where Joseph found work with a contractor. But Boston was crowded, dirty, and expensive. Other Polish immigrants were arriving in such numbers that jobs were becoming scarce and wages were being driven down. Joseph earned money through the winter, but the dream was not to live in a city as a laborer. The dream was land. In March of 1884, Joseph and Helena applied for a homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862. This remarkable law allowed American citizens and immigrants who had filed for citizenship to claim 160 acres of unsettled public land in the West. The requirement was that they prove up their land by building a dwelling and improving it through cultivation over 5 years. Joseph and Helena would receive their land completely free, becoming owners in a way that was impossible in Poland. The land they claimed was in Montrose County, Colorado, in the western slope of the Rocky Mountains. They traveled by train to Grand Junction, then by wagon into rough country where the mountains rose above them and the land was primarily sagebrush, piñon pine, and juniper. Their claim was a quarter section at 7,000 feet elevation, located in a valley with a small creek called Salt Creek that ran year-round. The nearest town was Delta, 20 miles away. The nearest neighbors were the Patterson family, over a mile away. The isolation was complete, but the land was theirs. Joseph began building their homestead in the spring of 1884. He and Helena constructed a one-room cabin, using logs from the piñon pine trees on their property. The cabin was 12 feet by 14 feet, with walls of notched logs, a roof of sawed over branches, and a small mud brick chimney. It took Joseph and Helena working together, with occasional help from the Patterson family, approximately 6 weeks to complete. That first year, they planted potatoes, beans, squash, and root vegetables in the thin mountain soil. The growing season at that elevation was short, only about 120 days between the last spring frost and the first autumn frost. But Joseph proved to be a skilled farmer. Their first harvest was modest but sufficient. That first winter in Colorado nearly killed them. They had not prepared adequately for the severity of the mountain climate. They had expected snow, but not the avalanche-level accumulation that began in October and did not stop until April. They had expected cold, but not the penetrating cold of 7,000-foot altitude, where the wind never stopped and the thermometer regularly dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. They had preserved some food. Helena had canned goods, stored potatoes, dried some vegetables, but not nearly enough. By February, they were rationing food. By March, they were genuinely hungry. A neighbor, William Patterson, came by on horseback in early April and found them both thin and weak. He brought flour, sugar, and lard. He brought beef. He brought survival. Without that intervention, the Nowak family would likely have starved. But Joseph and Helena learned. They rebuilt their cabin larger, with better insulation. They dug a small root cellar beneath the cabin floor. Helena led this project, drawing on the knowledge her grandmother had taught her. They established a larger garden and grew more food. They traded with neighbors. They learned animal husbandry, keeping chickens and eventually cows and pigs. By 1886, their homestead was thriving. Their second child, Thomas, was born in 1885. Their third child, Catherine, was born in 1887. Joseph was building a reputation as a skilled craftsman, doing stonework and carpentry for other homesteads in the area. Helena was known as a capable farmer and an excellent cook. The family was secure. It seemed the American dream was within reach. Then, in the winter of 1888, Joseph became ill. Helena did not understand what was wrong at first. He complained of pain in his chest, difficulty breathing, a persistent cough. There was no doctor in the county, only a nurse practitioner 40 miles away in Delta. By the time Helena convinced Joseph to travel to see her, his condition was severe. The nurse, a woman named Sarah Caldwell, diagnosed pneumonia complicated by pleurisy. She gave him medicines, quinine, digitalis, but pneumonia in 1888, in an isolated mountain valley, was often a death sentence. Joseph lingered for 3 weeks. He died on March 14, 1888, at the age of 32. Helena was 28 years old, with 3 children, Magda, age 6, Thomas, age 3, and Catherine, age 1, and 160 acres that she had to prove up alone or lose. The homestead law required that the homesteader be the head of the household and that they maintain continuous residence on the land. When a husband died, the widow could continue the claim, but only if she could demonstrate that she was actually homesteading, building, farming, and improving the land. The land office in Delta made it clear to Helena that they would be watching her carefully. A woman running a homestead alone was unusual. Many widows sold their claims and moved east or to towns. But Helena had no resources to start over, no family to help her, and most importantly, no intention of giving up what she and Joseph had built. She would prove up her land if it killed her. The challenge was survival. Helena had to farm, maintain the homestead, raise 3 children, and do it with her own 2 hands. During the growing season, she worked from sunrise to sunset in the fields. She preserved food obsessively, knowing that the next winter would determine whether her family lived or died. But she also had to do the work that Joseph had done: fencing, repairs, dealing with officials. She walked 12 miles to Delta to file papers. She negotiated with neighbors to borrow a plow. She taught herself skills she had never needed: how to patch a roof, how to repair a fence, how to slaughter and process a pig. Neighbors helped her. The Pattersons were genuinely kind, and other families in the settlement offered assistance, but they had their own homesteads to manage. Helena was essentially alone. It was during these desperate years, probably around 1890, that Helena began to think seriously about what her grandmother had taught her. Anna Kostrzewa had passed away in Poland. Helena received a letter in 1891 informing her of her grandmother's death, but the memory of her teachings remained vivid. Helena could picture her grandmother's face, could remember her voice, could recall the specific techniques she had demonstrated for fermentation, storage, and preservation. She thought about how in Starvation the winter was longer and colder than anything Colorado offered. If her grandmother could preserve enough food to keep a family alive for 8 months of winter, surely Helena could do the same. But there was a problem. In Starvation, the underground chambers where food was stored were dug into hillsides using natural earthen features. The Nowak homestead sat in relatively flat valley terrain. You could not dig a hillside chamber. However, you could dig down. The principle her grandmother had taught her, that the earth maintains a stable temperature at sufficient depth, did not require a hillside. It only required depth. Helena began to research. She talked with the few people in Montrose County who had knowledge of food preservation. She wrote letters to Agricultural Extension Services, though most of her letters were never answered. She thought about what she had learned from her grandmother about the physics of underground temperature, about how the earth insulates heat and cold, about how water vapor behaves in closed underground spaces. The science her grandmother understood intuitively, Helena began to understand more formally. At sea level, the Earth's temperature is stable at about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. This temperature exists at different depths, depending on latitude and local conditions. In Colorado at 7,000 feet elevation, the stable temperature zone is somewhat cooler, around 48 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and it begins at a depth of approximately 5 to 6 feet. This temperature is maintained because the Earth is an excellent insulator. The thermal mass of soil prevents rapid temperature change. The deeper you go, the more stable the environment becomes, because the insulating layers of earth above are thicker and more protective. At 6 feet below ground, even when the surface temperature drops to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the underground temperature remains around 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This is not cold enough to freeze vegetables, which would damage their cellular structure and make them inedible, but it is cold enough to dramatically slow bacterial growth and decomposition. At 50 degrees Fahrenheit, most pathogenic bacteria become essentially dormant. Spoilage organisms that would cause rapid decay at room temperature are nearly halted. Food that would rot in a warm cellar can last for months, sometimes more than a year, in an underground chamber maintained at this temperature. Fermentation requires a different principle. When properly fermented, which Helena's grandmother had taught her, certain foods undergo a biochemical transformation where lactobacillus and other beneficial bacteria consume the natural sugars in vegetables, producing lactic acid as a byproduct. This acidification prevents harmful bacterial growth and actually creates food that is more nutritious and more preservable than the original vegetable. A cabbage that might normally last a few weeks in cold storage can be fermented and remain edible and delicious for many months, even over a year. The fermentation process is temperature dependent. It works best in cool conditions, around 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is exactly what an underground chamber provides. Helena's grandmother had not understood the biochemistry in scientific terms, but she had understood the practical results. She knew that when you followed the proper steps, using the right salt content, maintaining proper submersion of vegetables beneath brine, and keeping the chamber at stable, cool temperature, you could transform fresh food into stable food that would nourish her family through the winter. In 1892, Helena made a decision that stunned everyone around her. She was going to excavate a large underground chamber specifically designed for food preservation. She began that spring, drawing up rough plans based on what her grandmother had taught her and what she had managed to learn from agricultural bulletins. She planned an underground chamber approximately 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 6 feet deep, much larger than anything typically constructed on a frontier homestead. She planned multiple compartments for different types of food. She planned for shelving, for ventilation, for a water-resistant entrance that would not flood. The cost would be substantial. The work would be enormous. and everyone who heard about it thought she was absolutely insane. William Patterson came by in April of 1892 and watched Helena marking out the excavation with stones. He was a kind man, truly, but he was also skeptical. "Helena," he said, "you have 3 young children and a homestead to manage. You're going to dig a hole in the ground for what? People don't do this. People store food in cellars above ground under their cabins. Why would you spend months digging when you could be farming?" Helena's older daughter, Magda, was there. She was 10 years old at the time, and she remembered this conversation later. Helena did not argue extensively. She simply said, "Because the earth is always the right temperature. Because my grandmother taught me that the earth keeps food alive. Because I will not watch my children go hungry again." Another neighbor, Jacob Steiner, was more openly mocking. "The underground kitchen madness," he called it, in a tone that made clear he thought Helena had lost her reason. At a gathering at the Patterson homestead in May, Steiner stood with several other neighbors and laughed about Helena's project. "She's digging to China," someone said. "She's running from her problems by running underground," another suggested. But Helena did not have the luxury of caring what people thought. She had a homestead to prove up, children to feed, and winter coming. She began digging in earnest in early June of 1892. Helena worked during the day after her children had completed their farm chores and in the early mornings before dawn. She had purchased a pickaxe and shovel with money she had been saving. Joseph had left her some tools, and neighbors occasionally lent equipment. The first challenge was moving the earth. She quickly learned that she could not physically remove 20 feet by 12 feet by 6 feet of earth on her own. The volume was approximately 1,440 cubic feet. At a working pace of 5 cubic feet per day, and that was optimistic, given the physical exhaustion and the heavy soil, the excavation would take 288 days of work, but the growing season was only 5 months. She had to find another solution. In June of 1892, Helena approached the school teacher, a man named Michael Kovac, who had emigrated from Hungary and understood immigrant struggles. She also approached the preacher at the small non-denominational church, Reverend Richard Allen. She made a proposal. She needed help excavating. In exchange, she would promise to preserve food for the settlement through the coming winter. If the winter was harsh, and winters in Colorado always were harsh, she would share her preserved food with families in need. This was a bold promise from a woman who had barely survived the previous winters herself. But it was also a promise that appealed to people's self-interest. Several families in the settlement had young children. Several had marginal harvests. Winter was always frightening. The possibility of a guaranteed food source was attractive. By July of 1892, Helena had assembled a crew of 5 men: Michael Kovac, Reverend Allen, William Patterson, Jacob Steiner, who had come around once he realized there would be payment, and a young man named Thomas Radcliffe, who worked as a general laborer. They worked in the early morning hours before the oppressive heat of summer, rotating shifts. The excavation proceeded more rapidly. By August, the main chamber was complete. The earth they removed, over 1,400 cubic feet of it, had to be moved somewhere. Helena had them pile it around the edges of the chamber, creating a berm that would help with insulation and water drainage. The surrounding soil was heavy, iron-rich, and difficult to work with. One of the workers, a man named Elliot, suffered a minor broken leg when the wall of the excavation collapsed on him. He was treated by Sarah Caldwell, the nurse, and after 3 weeks of recovery, he returned to work. These were not soft people doing this work. These were frontiersmen and immigrant laborers accustomed to danger and injury. The deeper chambers required more sophisticated work. Joseph's carpentry knowledge, which Helena had learned by watching and working alongside him, became crucial. She instructed the men on how to build support structures using wooden beams, how to create compartments using salvaged wood from old structures, how to construct shelving that would hold substantial weight. By September, the main excavation was complete, and the real work, finishing the interior, began. Helena worked alongside the men, teaching them her grandmother's design principles. She wanted specific areas with specific purposes. One compartment for root vegetables, where she would maintain temperature and humidity by piling sand around the vegetables and ensuring some air circulation. One area for fermented foods, the jars of sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and fermented fruits that would be her family's vitamin source through the winter. One compartment for dried foods, the herbs, the dried meats, the dried fruits that concentrated nutrition into small packages. One area for cool storage of milk, butter, and eggs, where temperature had to be most carefully managed. Helena's children participated as much as they could. Magda, at 10 years old, was becoming quite capable. She could help carry water, could assist in organizing materials, could understand what her mother was trying to create. Thomas, at 7, was still young, but he contributed where he could. Catherine, at 5, mostly got in the way, but Helena kept her nearby, wanting her children to understand that this work was important, that this project was about family survival, that the labor of building something was how you built your life in America. The physical toll on Helena was substantial. By autumn, she had lost weight. Her hands were blistered and calloused. Her back ached constantly. But the chamber was taking shape. By October of 1892, it was ready for food storage. Helena's first test of her system came in October of 1892, as the harvest season peaked. She had grown substantially more vegetables than in previous years, deliberately planting extra crops specifically for this experiment. The question everyone was asking, sometimes with support and sometimes with mockery, was whether food stored underground would actually preserve better than food stored in traditional ways. Jacob Steiner, who had worked on the excavation, was now genuinely curious. He had seen the work, understood the design, and was starting to understand that Helena was not crazy, but rather was executing a plan based on knowledge and principle. That autumn, Helena stored potatoes in the underground chamber, tons of them, stacked in boxes with sand layers, maintaining the environment her grandmother had taught her. She stored root vegetables, beets, turnips, parsnips, carrots, in sand as well. She fermented cabbage in ceramic jars, using salt percentages she had memorized from her grandmother's teaching. She dried herbs and vegetables, suspended them from the wooden beams of the underground chamber. She stored eggs in a preservative solution. The chamber was full by November. Above ground, her neighbors stored their harvests in the traditional ways. Potatoes in above-ground root cellars that were cold, but not consistently cold. Vegetables in barns and sheds, where temperature fluctuated with the seasons. Some families did not preserve much at all, relying on the assumption that they could trade for food during the winter, or, if supplies ran out, that spring was not too far away. The winter of 1892 to 1893 was moderately harsh, not catastrophic, but difficult. Snow came in November, cold settled in. Families began depending on their preserved food, and by February and March, the traditional preservation methods had failed. The food in the above-ground root cellars began to spoil. Potatoes sprouted. Root vegetables developed soft spots and rotted. Food that was supposed to last until spring was becoming unusable. Families who had not preserved adequately were already rationing. Some people were genuinely hungry, but Helena's family was eating well. She had such abundance of preserved food that she was actually able to share with neighbors. By March of 1893, the entire settlement knew that the underground kitchen worked. It worked brilliantly. The potatoes were in perfect condition, firm, fresh, as if they had been stored for only weeks rather than 6 months. The fermented cabbage was delicious, complex in flavor, and packed with nutrients that prevented the scurvy and nutritional deficiency that threatened settlements in winter. The dried vegetables could be reconstituted into soups and stews. The eggs had preserved perfectly. Helena was not crazy. She was brilliant. In the spring of 1893, with the vindication of her system now obvious, Helena decided to expand. She began designing a second, larger underground kitchen. This one would be truly ambitious in scale, designed not just for her family, but as a community resource. But before she could fully develop those plans, a catastrophe struck the Colorado western slope that would prove the true value of her investment. In the spring of 1893, the United States entered a severe economic depression known as the Panic of 1893. Banks failed. Credit dried up. Agricultural prices collapsed. The value of crops dropped so dramatically that farmers who had abundant harvests could not afford to transport them to market. But on the Colorado western slope, there was another, more immediate crisis: a crop blight, a fungal disease later identified as late potato blight, the same disease that had caused the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, struck the region in early summer of 1893. The blight was devastating. It spread rapidly through the potato fields, turning leaves black and causing the tubers themselves to rot in the ground. Entire harvests were destroyed. Families who had expected to harvest potatoes found only black rot in their fields. The situation became even more dire when, in October of 1893, an early blizzard dropped an unprecedented amount of snow in the mountain passes. A supply route to Denver that the settlement depended on became impassable. An avalanche destroyed several wagons attempting to cross. 3 people died in the snow. The supply route would not reopen until spring. The settlement was cut off. The region that had once seemed to offer unlimited abundance suddenly faced severe scarcity. And winter was coming. By November of 1893, the reality was becoming clear. Many families in Montrose County had lost their potato crop to the blight. The visual evidence was heartbreaking. Fields that should have been black with healthy potato plants were instead black with rot and disease. Corn had failed due to early frost. The squash and root vegetables that had been secondary crops were not sufficient to sustain large families through 6 months of winter. A family of 6 typically needed at least 200 pounds of potatoes to survive the winter. With crop failure, many families had perhaps 50 pounds, maybe less. The settlement would face genuine hunger. Some families would starve unless conditions improved. But conditions would not improve until spring, which was months away. The supply route remained closed by snow. Reverend Allen convened a meeting in early November to assess the situation. 23 families attended. The conversation was grim. Thomas Radcliffe reported that his family was already rationing. "We've got maybe 4 months of food and winter's 6 months," he said. Martha Patterson, William Patterson's wife, spoke about children in the settlement who were already showing signs of nutritional deficiency. Elizabeth Carlson's boy has lost the spring in his step. Sarah Mercer's daughter has a cough that won't stop. These were the early signs of the hunger that would deepen through winter. William Patterson then stood and said, "Well, we know someone with food." Everyone knew what he meant. The underground kitchen. Helena's madness that had become their salvation. But it was not appropriate for people to simply come demanding food, even in desperation. This was the frontier where a certain pride and dignity had to be maintained, even in extremity. That's when Jacob Steiner, the man who had most openly mocked Helena's project, stood up. He was a man of about 50, weathered and practical. "I'm going to go see Helena," he said. "I'm going to ask her directly." He paused. then continued, his voice rough with emotion. I've laughed at her. We all did. I called her crazy to her face and to others, but that woman was right and we were wrong. I'll eat crow if I have to. My children are not going to go hungry because I'm too proud to admit I was mistaken. Then, quietly, and without making a grand gesture about it, Helena Nowak began sharing her underground kitchen with the settlement. She was not arrogant about it. She did not say, I told you so, or make people feel foolish for mocking her project. She simply opened her chamber to the settlement. Jacob Steiner came to her in December, actually in tears, asking if his family could buy some of her preserved food. Helena, he said, his voice breaking, I was a fool. I mocked you. I called this madness. I was wrong. My children are hungry. Will you help us? Helena looked at him with compassion. She was 34 years old at that moment. She had already lived through more hardship than most people experience in a lifetime. She had the character that comes from surviving impossibility. Jacob, she said, there is nothing to forgive. You were skeptical and you had the courage to look at evidence and change your mind. That is not foolishness. That is wisdom. She led him into the underground kitchen. He descended the wooden stairs and saw it fully for perhaps the first time. The shelves loaded with jars of sauerkraut and fermented vegetables, the bins of potatoes still firm and fresh after 5 months of storage, the dried herbs hanging from the beams, filling the chamber with the smell of preserved abundance, the eggs carefully packed in their preservation solution, the dried meats and dried fruits concentrated with nutrition. He literally fell to his knees. This was not just food. This was the difference between his children eating and his children starving. This was the future. How much will you sell me? He asked, his voice still shaking. Helena gave him potatoes, fermented vegetables, dried herbs, and preserved eggs. She refused payment in money. Instead, she said, when spring comes and people begin building their own underground kitchens, I want you to work alongside them. I want you to share what you've learned. Tell them that what seemed like madness was actually wisdom. Be their advocate the way you are now willing to be. Jacob agreed immediately. By the time he left the underground kitchen, he was carrying food that would sustain his family for at least 2 months. And he was carrying something else as well, a new understanding of his relationship to knowledge, to tradition, to the woman who had refused to give up on something she believed in. Over the following weeks, other families came. Some came with money, trying to trade. Helena accepted payment from families with resources, the Pattersons, who had money put aside, the Mercer family, who had some cattle to trade. But from families with nothing, she did not accept payment. She gave freely to Martha and Thomas Radcliffe and their 4 children. She gave to Sarah Mercer, whose daughter was coughing through the night. She gave to the Kovach family and to a family named Olsen, who had immigrated from Norway and were struggling to understand the climate they had moved to. By mid-January of 1894, her stores had decreased substantially. She had given away perhaps 1/3 of what she had preserved. Her own family was eating less, but the settlement was eating. And children were being kept alive by food that Helena had stored and fermented and preserved through her own labor. By February of 1894, Helena's underground kitchen was being depleted. She had stored food for her family of 4 and had assumed modest sharing. But the hunger in the settlement was greater than she had anticipated. Families came regularly, pregnant women, young children, elders. She gave food to everyone. Her stores would not last until spring. She was likely to run short before May. But she also knew that this was the price of her knowledge. She had been given these skills by her grandmother for a purpose, not to hoard, but to share, to keep her community alive. In March of 1894, when her stores were nearly depleted and the settlement was approaching crisis again, a change came. Reverend Allen had written to the Colorado Agricultural College in Fort Collins, describing Helena's underground kitchen and how it had kept her family fed through a winter when everyone else was struggling. He had also mentioned that the settlement was in danger. The college responded by sending Professor Thomas Whitmore, a botanist and agricultural engineer, to investigate. Whitmore arrived in Montrose County in late March of 1894, bringing with him not only expertise but also the legitimacy of institutional knowledge. Professor Whitmore spent a week at the Nowak homestead, examining the underground kitchen, studying Helena's methods, and learning from her about fermentation, temperature management, and preservation techniques. He was astonished. He had been trained in modern agricultural methods at an American university, and here he found a system that was superior to most of what he had been taught. He photographed the underground chamber, took detailed measurements, collected samples of her fermented foods for analysis, and interviewed Helena extensively about her methods and her grandmother's teachings. When Whitmore returned to Fort Collins, he carried with him detailed documentation of Helena's underground kitchen. He also carried seeds of a revolutionary idea that the knowledge of immigrant communities, passed down through generations, could be integrated with modern science to create superior agricultural and preservation practices. He published a bulletin distributed through the Colorado Agricultural Extension Service, describing the Nowak underground kitchen as a model for frontier preservation. He explained the temperature dynamics. He detailed the fermentation process. He recommended that other settlements in the Rocky Mountains adopt similar systems. By the summer of 1894, other families in Montrose County were beginning their own underground kitchens. The Pattersons started one. The Steiner family began excavation. A community north of Delta was planning construction. The knowledge was spreading. Helena, despite having nearly depleted her own stores in saving her community, found herself becoming something of a teacher. She spent time with these other families, explaining her methods, helping them understand the principles, guiding their construction. Farmers who had laughed at the underground kitchen madness now came to her with respect, asking her to help them build their own. Helena's children grew up in this environment of innovation and learning, shaped by the experience of watching their mother refuse to accept defeat and watching their community transformed by her knowledge. Each of them carried forward the legacy in different ways, but all of them maintained the principle that ancestral wisdom combined with willingness to learn created something greater than either alone could achieve. Magda, the oldest, born in 1883, became deeply involved in food preservation work from childhood. She was 10 years old when her mother began the excavation of the underground kitchen, and she participated actively in its construction and development. She learned fermentation directly from her mother, who drew on her grandmother's teaching. As she grew into adolescence and young adulthood, she became fascinated with the chemistry of preservation. She corresponded with agricultural extension agents, read everything she could find about food science, and developed innovations in fermentation techniques. In 1898, at just 15 years old, she developed a method for fermenting green tomatoes that allowed them to ripen properly underground while maintaining their nutritional content. Previously, green tomatoes stored underground remained green and underdeveloped. She married Joseph Kowalski in 1900, a Polish immigrant farmer, and together they built one of the most extensive underground kitchen networks in the county. By 1920, they operated a community food preservation and trading business that employed 12 people and served 53 families across Montrose County. Magda lived to age 84, passing away in 1967, still consulting on food preservation until the year before her death. Thomas, born in 1885, followed his father's path into carpentry and engineering. He was only 2 years old when his father died, so he had no direct memory of Joseph. But he inherited his father's tools, and his reputation for skilled work. As he grew up watching his mother design and supervise the construction of the underground kitchen, he became fascinated with the engineering challenges of excavation, support structures, and environmental control. He apprenticed with skilled carpenters in Delta and Grand Junction during his teenage years and developed a reputation for precision and innovation in his work. Thomas became the builder that families called when they wanted underground kitchens built properly. Between 1900 and 1950, Thomas Nowak, and later his sons, designed and constructed over 120 documented underground kitchens throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. He incorporated innovations, better ventilation systems, improved water drainage, more efficient compartmentalization that made underground kitchens more functional and longer lasting. Thomas married a woman named Elizabeth Chen, whose family had immigrated from Guangzhou province in China, and their marriage was unusual and even controversial for rural Colorado in 1905. But Thomas and Elizabeth had 6 children together and raised a family that bridged cultural communities. Thomas lived to age 82 and worked in construction until he was 75 years old. Catherine, born in 1887, was the youngest of Helena's first 3 children. She had different talents and interests from her siblings, while Magda was drawn to the science of fermentation and Thomas to engineering. Catherine was interested in understanding the larger agricultural and ecological systems. She was a curious child who asked questions about why crops failed, why some years were abundant and others scarce, how weather patterns changed. When Professor Thomas Whitmore visited the homestead in 1894, Catherine, then just 6 years old, listened to his conversations with her mother and became fascinated by the idea of studying agriculture formally. Her parents supported this unusual ambition for a girl. She attended the Colorado State Normal School, now Colorado State University, where she was one of only a handful of women studying agriculture in the 1900s. She completed her studies in 1903 and returned to Montrose County, where she married David Patterson, the son of their neighbor William Patterson, in 1904. Together with David, Catherine established an agricultural research partnership that studied crop diseases, climate patterns, and soil conditions on the western slope. She became one of the first women to publish agricultural research in Colorado, and her work on late blight disease was cited by University Extension Services. Catherine and David had 4 children, all of whom pursued education and professional work in agriculture, science, or medicine. Catherine lived to age 91, passing away in 1978. Julia, Helena, and Carl's daughter, born in 1897, was interested in education and community health. She became one of the first teachers in the region who integrated food science and nutrition into the classroom curriculum, teaching children about the science behind food preservation alongside reading and mathematics. She helped establish a library in Delta and spent much of her professional life advocating for rural education. Michael, Helena, and Carl's younger son, born in 1899, became an attorney and spent his career advocating for the rights of immigrant communities and small farmers. Helena Nowak continued to live on her homestead, successfully proving up her 160 acres and receiving official title to her land in 1889. She was remarried in 1896 to a widower named Karl Zielinski, a Polish immigrant who had his own homestead and who deeply respected Helena's knowledge and accomplishments. They combined their properties and had 2 more children together, Julia, born in 1897, and Michael, born in 1899. Karl was a builder, and together with Helena, he designed and constructed underground kitchens that became famous throughout Colorado. By 1905, there were over 50 underground kitchens operating in Montrose County, nearly all of them based on principles that Helena had adapted from her grandmother's teachings. Helena lived until 1927, reaching the age of 68. She died in her sleep in the homestead, where she had arrived as a desperate widow with 3 young children. Her funeral was attended by over 200 people, farmers, their families, community leaders, the current county agricultural extension agent, and several professors from the Colorado Agricultural College. One of those professors, a former student of Thomas Whitmore, remarked that Helena Nowak had done more for agricultural innovation in the Rocky Mountains than almost any academic working in a laboratory. He was not exaggerating. The ripple effects of her work continued long after her death. The underground kitchen beneath her homestead remained in active use for more than a century, eventually becoming something of a local historical monument. It was last used for food storage in the 1980s, when modern refrigeration had made it unnecessary. But the chamber remained structurally sound and intact, a testament to the careful engineering of its construction. In 1994, over 100 years after its construction, the chamber was still maintaining temperatures between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year, exactly as designed. Visitors to the site in the 21st century can descend into the underground kitchen and see the wooden shelving that Helena and Carl designed, can see the compartments that are still organized in the system Helena developed, can touch the earth walls that have protected food and knowledge for more than a century. What makes Helena's story remarkable is not simply that she preserved food successfully. Many people in the 1890s preserved food. What makes her remarkable is that she synthesized traditional knowledge with the realities of a new frontier, that she dared to implement a radical idea despite public mockery, and that she remained committed to her vision long enough to prove its value. The principles she and her grandmother understood, the insulating properties of earth, the stable temperature at depth, the chemistry of fermentation, the importance of humidity control, are the same principles used by modern food scientists and farmers today. A contemporary underground food storage system operates on identical physics. When you dig a properly constructed root cellar today, you follow principles that are directly derived from Helena Nowak's work in 1892. The science behind what Helena accomplished can be described in modern terms. The Earth's thermal conductivity, its ability to transfer and conduct heat, is approximately 10 times greater than air. This means that Earth acts as an excellent heat conductor initially, but once a stable temperature is reached at depth, that temperature becomes locked in place by the insulating mass of all the Earth above it. The specific heat capacity of soil, the amount of energy required to change its temperature by 1 degree, is high. This creates thermal inertia. A change of 1 degree in the summer temperature at the surface might take 30 days to travel down 6 feet of earth. By the time it arrives, it has been smoothed out by the insulating properties of the intermediate layers. The result is that at 6 feet depth, you achieve what engineers call a thermally buffered zone, where temperature fluctuations are minimal. Fermentation, which Helena's grandmother taught through practice, is a biochemical process where lactobacillus bacteria metabolize sugars in plant material, producing lactic acid as a byproduct. This lactic acid makes the environment inhospitable to putrefactive bacteria, the organisms that cause rot and decomposition. The process requires 3 conditions: the right salt concentration, typically 2 to 3% by weight; an anaerobic environment, lack of oxygen, which is naturally achieved when vegetables are submerged in brine; and appropriate temperature. The underground temperature of 48 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit is actually ideal for fermentation. It slows the process enough to develop complex flavors while still allowing the beneficial bacteria to thrive. A fermented cabbage stored at room temperature will become mushy and develop off flavors in a few weeks. The same fermented cabbage stored in Helena's underground kitchen would remain firm and flavorful for more than a year. This is not magic.
This is thermodynamics and microbiology working exactly as the laws of physics dictate. Moreover, Helena's success had a broader cultural impact. It demonstrated that the knowledge brought by immigrant communities was valuable, not something to be abandoned in shame as immigrants assimilated to American culture. The Oklahoma settlement of Fort Washita adopted Helena's methods. The New Mexico territories began researching underground food storage based on Professor Whitmore's publications about Helena's work. Agricultural bulletins about the underground kitchen method, as it came to be called, were distributed from coast to coast. By 1910, the U.S. Department of Agriculture had officially recommended underground food storage systems for mountainous regions and northern climates. Helena's innovation influenced how settlement communities across the American West approached food security for generations. By the 1920s, over 500 documented underground kitchens had been constructed in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, and Montana, all following principles that could be traced back to Helena Nowak and her grandmother's wisdom. The village of Starvation, Helena's birthplace in Poland, eventually learned about her accomplishments through letters and through occasional visitors who brought news. Helena had written to her cousin still living in Poland, describing her homestead, her children's achievements, her underground kitchen, and her work with her husband Carl. These letters circulated through the village. The knowledge that the Nowak family had produced a pioneering American innovator created a sense of pride in the village, particularly among women who were considering emigration. In the early 20th century, when many villagers were debating whether to emigrate to America, stories of Helena's success became part of the conversation. She had not just survived in America, she had created something that changed how people lived. That was the American dream made tangible. Several women from Starvation emigrated to the western slope of Colorado specifically to work with or learn from Helena's methods. One of them, a distant cousin named Anna Kowalski, arrived in 1901 and became one of the first women working professionally in agricultural preservation. Perhaps the deepest lesson in Helena's story is about the value of traditional knowledge in the modern world. Her grandmother taught her through example and practice, not through textbooks or formal education. That knowledge passed to Helena as instinct and understanding, not as written rules. When Helena arrived in America without any formal agricultural training, without any scientific credentials, with only her grandmother's teachings and her determination to survive, she possessed something more valuable than credentials. She possessed knowledge that was tested by centuries of use, knowledge that worked because it was grounded in natural physical laws. When she combined that knowledge with her new American experience, with the specific conditions of her homestead, with the specific needs of her community, with her willingness to learn and adapt, she created something genuinely innovative. Contemporary researchers in food science and traditional ecological knowledge have recognized Helena as a pioneering example of what happens when ancestral wisdom is taken seriously and given legitimate application. Her story appears in modern agricultural textbooks not as a historical curiosity, but as a legitimate case study in food preservation technology. The underground kitchen is mentioned in sustainable agriculture guides. Her fermentation protocols appear in modern food preservation manuals. Her principles are taught in permaculture education programs. All of this comes from a woman who had no formal education beyond basic literacy, who learned by watching her grandmother work with earth and vegetables and salt and thyme. This is what drives human progress, not the abandonment of the old for the new, but the synthesis of time-tested knowledge with contemporary opportunity. Not the rejection of where we come from, but the integration of our past with our present to build a better future. Helena Nowak had every reason to abandon her grandmother's teaching. She might have tried to be fully American, to adopt only the modern methods of the American agricultural establishment.
but she honored the knowledge that her grandmother had given her. She understood that wisdom does not age, that principles discovered through generations of experience don't become obsolete simply because you move to a new country. In doing so, she proved something that we need to remember constantly in our modern world, that sometimes the answer to future challenges lies not in moving forward faster, but in respectfully turning back to understand what previous generations knew. If you found Helena's story compelling, if you want to learn about other individuals who change their communities through courage and ingenuity, please subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone you know who appreciates historical stories and the resilience of immigrant communities. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. What aspect of Helena's story resonated most with you? Was it her determination to refuse defeat after losing her husband and facing poverty? Was it the value of traditional knowledge passed through generations of women? Was it her willingness to help her community even when she had limited resources herself? Was it the way she combined ancestral wisdom with frontier innovation to solve a real problem? Until next time, stay curious, honor those who came before, and never underestimate the wisdom hiding in your own family history.